In this video, we're going to implement a very popular component, which is a tabbed component. And you will see tabbed components on many websites these days, so it's great to learn how to build one yourself. So the component that we're going to build in this video is this one. Now, a tabbed component can appear in many different ways, but what they all have in common is that they have some kind of tabs, like these here, and when you click the tab, then the content of this area below will change. And so that's exactly what happens here with these buttons. So basically these three are our tabs, and then as we click on one of the tabs, it will reveal the associated content. So a little bit like tabs here in our browser, right? So each browser tab has its own web page, and so here each tab has its own content area, basically. So I'm sure you've seen this on other websites, and so let's now go ahead and implement this ourselves. Okay. Now, for this component, we actually need a bunch of HTML. So let's first take a look at that. So the whole tabbed component in our case is called operations. So let's scroll down here also. And so this section here is about the operations we can do on a bank account, and therefore this component here is called operations. And you can also see that here on the page. Then we have the tab container, basically. So that's this element. And so you can also see it here again, and it's the element which will contain the three tabs. And so each tab is itself a button, and it has this class of operations tab. Okay. Then below that we have the content. And in fact, we have three contents. So we have one content element here for each of the tabs. All right. So the first one here, as you see, is called operations content 1. Then the other one is operations content 2 and operations content 3. So as we click on one of these tabs, we will not create any new content. What we will do instead is to hide the other tabs, basically. So you see that right now, this first one here has the operations content active class. And so therefore this one is visible and all the others are hidden. And what's also important here is that these buttons here, they have this data tab attribute. And so this one is number 1, and this will then be associated with this class name here. So operations content and then again 1. But more about that in a minute when we actually implement this ourselves. So for now, we just need to get down the basic structure of the HTML here. And it might be a good idea for you to pause the video and take a minute or two to get yourself familiar with this HTML structure and all of the class names that are involved here. Okay, and you can even take a look at the CSS, because there's also a lot of CSS involved here. All right, so of course I couldn't write all of this code here together with you now, because that would take way too long. All right, but anyway, let's now build this tabbed component here. And we're going to start by selecting the tabs. Okay, and I will keep the elements here open so we can see it at all time. And so you see that the buttons, they have the class operations tab. So tabs equal document.query selector all, and then with the class operations tab. Then let's also select the tabs container. And so that is this element here. Let's actually go ahead and copy it. And finally, also the three content areas. So that's here operations content. You see, cannot copy it for some reason. Doesn't matter. So tabs content is document.querySelector all. So because again, we have 3 of them. All right. So we have our selections nicely done. And now we can actually work on the functionality. And let's start by adding event handlers to these buttons here, right? Because that is the action that we actually want to handle in this component. So we could do it like this. So taking all the tabs, and then on each of them, we could attach an event handler. So for example, like this. So for each, because we want to do it on each of them, so we get then each tab, and then tab.add event listener, click, and let's just use a quick arrow function here, because this is really just a demonstration. Well, nothing happens. Let's try to reload this page. Yeah, indeed. Now we get the tab locked to the console. Now, however, as we already learned in the last video, doing this here is a bad practice. Because what if we had like 200 tabs? Then we would have 200 copies of this exact callback function here, and that would simply slow down the page. So that's not at all desirable. And so let's get rid of this, and one more time use event delegation. And remember that for event delegation, we need to attach the event handler on the common parent element of all the elements that we're interested in. And in our case, that is this tabs container, right? So we have our buttons here. So right here, our buttons, and the common parent of all of them is this tab container that we already selected previously. And so let's attach our event handler to that element instead. So tabs container.add event listener, click. We need the event, of course, so that we can figure out where the click happened. And so let's now actually work on our matching strategy. Okay, so we already know that we are interested in the buttons. And so let's now figure out which button was clicked. So let's actually create an element called clicked that we can then use to work with. And so what about this? So what about simply using the e.target? Well, let's see. So in our console, let's now click somewhere here. And indeed, now we got the button that was clicked. Okay. However, there is a problem when we click here on this number. So you see that now we did not get a button, but we got this span element. And that's because inside of this button, we actually have another element. And so now, even though it looked like we clicked on the button here, or here, for example, actually we are clicking on this span element, right? So we are not actually clicking on the button, but we still need the button. So no matter if we click on this button itself or here on the span element, we actually need the button element itself, because from that button, we will need to read this data tab attribute here. Because as I mentioned earlier, this one contains the number of the tab that should become visible. And so here, this data attribute becomes really important to store information in the DOM. So basically, we need a way of finding the button element whenever we click on this span element, right? Now, one simple way to fix it, which would not really fix it actually, is to do some DOM traversing and simply select the parent element. We can move up the DOM tree, and instead of simply taking e.target, we can use the parent element of that. So let's see what happens then. And so now indeed, when we click on the number, we get the button. And so again, that's because that is the parent element of that span. Now the problem appears when we click on the button itself, because now of course we will also get the parent of the button element. And so that is this container. But of course, that is not what we want. So basically what we want is to get the button no matter if we click here on the span or on the button itself. So we need a way of selecting the parent element that is always a tab. And can you think of a special method that we learned previously to do that? Well, the solution is right here in the previous video. Well, and that's down here somewhere. So remember that we want a way of going upwards, but we want to specify that we want to select an operations tab. And so we can use this closest method for exactly that. So remember that I said that this method is going to be really helpful in event delegation. And so now that's actually the case. Okay, so this method makes it really easy for us to dynamically get the element that we're interested in. So here, instead of always selecting the parent element, we will search basically for the closest operations tab. And so here we need the exact same query as that. All right, and this should actually now fix our problem. So let's see. When we click the button itself, then we get the button. And when we click the number here, so the span, then we also get the button, because now it finds the closest parent with this class name, which indeed is the button itself, so the tab. And here we get the tab number 2, as you can see down here. And here we get tab number 3. Great. And let's actually immediately do something with this selected tab. So the tab that is currently active here has a different style, as you can see. So it's a bit moved up. And so that's because the active tab basically has this class. So where's that? It has this class of operations tab active. All right. So we can simply add that to the element that was just clicked. So class list dot add operations tab active. Okay. And now as we click, you see that it activates basically this tab. Now, of course, later, then all the other tabs will have to move down, but we're going to take care of that in a second. Because now watch what happens when we actually click on the tabs container itself. So outside of any of the buttons, but still in the tabs container where this event listener is actually attached to. So you see that we get null here. And that's because null is the result of the closest method here when there is no matching parent element to be found. So of course, when we click here in this tabs container, then there's going to be no parent with this class. And so therefore, as I just said, we get null. And so we need to fix that now in our code and basically ignore any clicks that happen on that area. So basically ignore any clicks where the result is then null. All right. So we can do that by saying if there is no clicked, then return immediately. And this is something that we haven't done before. So what I'm doing here is called a guard clause. So it's basically an if statement which will return early if some condition is matched. So in this case, when there's nothing clicked, then we want to immediately finish this function. And in this case, when we have null, which is a falsy value, then not falsy will become true, and then the function will return, and none of the code that's after it will be executed. But of course, if clicked does exist, then this return will not be executed, and the rest of the code will be executed just fine. So this is a more modern way of writing this. So we could have written instead also, if there is a clicked element, then do this. And this is the more traditional way, as we have been doing it all the time. But this is actually more modern because it looks a bit nicer because we don't need to create all these additional blocks. So in this case, just this block, but sometimes when we have so many conditions, it can become a little bit confusing. And then it's a bit cleaner to simply return the function immediately if a certain condition is matched. And again, in this case, whenever there is no clicked element here, then we want to simply return the function right away. And so then that code here will not be executed, but otherwise, of course, it will be executed. And so let's now see what happens. So now clicking outside, nothing happens. Of course, we still get the null here, but no error occurs because now JavaScript is no longer trying to execute this line of code here. Okay. But now let's actually take care of basically putting all of these other buttons down, as I was saying. So when I click one of them, then the other ones should move down. So basically, we should remove this class from them, right? And so the solution to that is before we add this class here to anyone, we will simply remove it on all of the tabs. So we remove them on all. So that's all the tabs dot for each. And so each tab I'm simply calling T here, and then tab dot class list dot remove. And so now that should work. And yeah, it does. Okay, so this is something that we do quite usually. So basically clearing the class on all of them and then only add it afterwards on one of them. So let's add a comment here, active tab. But now finally, let's actually activate the content area itself, because that's the main part that we're actually interested in. Now, remember that the information about which content area should be displayed is here in this data attribute. So let me click again. And so in this case, we want the tab number 2. And so that's this number 2 is encoded here basically in this data attribute. So having the number 2 here means that we want to select the element which has the class of operations content 2. Okay, so let's do that. Let me grab this here. So this selector, and then let's select it. So document.querySelector. And now I'm using a template string here because, of course, we don't want to hard code the number 2 here, but instead we want to get that exactly from the data attribute that I just showed you. So let me just show that again to you. Now we get an error here. Let's just put something there for now. So it is called data tab. Okay. And so remember, all these attributes are in the element and then in the dataset property. So the element that was clicked is indeed stored in our variable clicked, right? So every time we click a button, that button is then stored in the clicked variable. And so then .dataset.tab. So that's only the part after the data, remember? So it's just tab. So in this case, it's going to be 2. And so we already have that now selected, and then we want to add a special class to it. So that's ClassList.add. And let's just check out the class that we need to add. So we can see that here on the first content area, which is already active. And so the class here is OperationsContentActive. Okay, and one more time, you can check out the CSS to figure out why actually this makes the element active. And we can quickly do that ourselves. So here it is, actually, the active, right? And so basically what this does is to change the display property to something which is not none. So previously, without this active part, so just operation content makes it display none, which basically hides it. But then as it becomes active, we give it display grid and then specify all of these properties there. All right. So this should actually already be working. Just to really see this a bit better in the console also, let's log this value also to the console. Okay, but let's see. And indeed, it now appeared down here. Great. So it's no longer hidden. And indeed, we successfully read that value here from the data tab, which is 2. And the same is going to happen here for 3. And so you see that the content number 3 also appeared down here. Now, of course, this is not quite finished yet because we want the other ones to be hidden. So that's the whole idea of this component. And so basically all we need to do is to do the same that we did for the tabs. So basically removing the active class for all of them before then adding it to the one that we're interested in. All right, so basically just what we have here. So let's select all the contents, and that we actually already have here, right? So tabs content is also a node list because of query selector all that we can now loop over and then remove that active class from all of them. So tabs content dot for each, and I'm just calling it C very short here. So C for content. So class list remove. And so you see that it's always the same idea. So it's all about removing and adding classes to manipulate the page to look just like we want. All right. So this comment is actually more here. So activate tab. And here, remove the active classes for both the tab and the content areas. And with this, actually our component should already be working. So let's see. And yeah, beautiful. It works great. All right, let's just get rid of all these different console.logs here because we only need them for development. But now we're done. So let's just quickly recap. And as I just mentioned a minute ago, the whole idea when we build components like this is to just add and remove classes as necessary to manipulate the content to our needs. And actually the exact same thing we did with the modal window. So if you take a look at the code, it's a bit similar. So to hide and display the modal window, all we do is to add and remove this hidden class. Now in this case, it's a little bit more complex, but the idea is always the same. It's to work with classes that have some styles for showing and hiding the classes. And so if you're not yet really familiar with CSS, it's also important that you really check out the CSS to build these components for yourself. And the same goes for the HTML. But of course, I could not write this code here as well, because then this tutorial would take like 1 hour instead of 15 minutes. But anyway, I hope that this was fun. Make sure to understand what we did here, including the HTML and CSS. And then let's go right to the next video. Let's now create a nice effect on our page navigation where all the links fade out when we hover over one of them, except for the link that we actually hovered over. And this will teach us something really valuable, which is how to pass arguments into event handler functions. And the effect that I mean is this one. So when we hover over one of the links, you see all the others fade out like this, and that includes even the logo there on the left side. So let's do that here in our page, and let's again start by taking a look here at the HTML. So we have these links. So each of them is a nav link. And so these are the elements that we're going to be working with. So menu fade animation. But now, of course, we do not want to attach an event listener to each of these links. So we already know that we should do event delegation here instead. So let's find the common parent element of all of the links, and also including the logo there. So if we were only working with the links, it would be this element, but we also want to work with the logo here. And so let's actually use this entire navigation here as our parent container on which we will handle the event that is going to bubble up from the links. So keep in mind that all of this works because events bubble up from their target. So let's select the navigation here and store it in a variable .querySelector.nav. Okay, and actually let me put this here at the very top because we are going to need this a bit later. And it is a good practice to have all of these at the top. And the same actually here. So why not have all of the selections right at the top? That makes it a bit easier to understand the whole file. Okay. But anyway, let's now attach an event listener to that navigation. But now we're not going to use the click event, but instead the mouse over event. Okay. And I think that previously we have already used the mouse enter event, and mouse over is actually similar to mouse enter, with the big difference that mouse enter does not bubble. Okay. But here we need the event to actually bubble so that it can even reach the navigation element. And so therefore we use mouse over. All right. So then attach the function here. And there are also kind of opposite events of mouse over and mouse enter. And we use these to basically undo what we do on the hover. So the opposite of mouse enter is mouse leave. And the opposite of this mouse over is mouse out. And so we're also going to need that one. So let's put that here right away. So mouse out. All right. And as always, if you need to know more, then you can check out the MDN documentation. Great. So we have our parent element. And now, as always, we need to match the element that we are actually looking for. And so in this case, that are these elements with the navlink class on them. And so let's simply check for that. So if e.target, as you already know, .ClassList.contains the navlink class, well, then let's do something. So you see that this time around, I'm not using the closest methods. And that's because there are simply no child elements that we could accidentally click here in this link, right? So that was the reason why we needed the closest method here in this tabs, because we had this button, but then we could also click on the span element. And so here we then needed to find the closest element, so the closest button to both of these places. Okay, but here that's not necessary. And so therefore a simple check like we have here is enough. And so now we can actually say that the clicked is then e.target. Okay, so I called it clicked before. Let's call it now actually the link. But this is similar to what we did before also. So creating a variable which contains the element that we're working with. All right. And so now, next up, we need to select the sibling elements. So basically all the other links. All right. And remember that we can do that by going to the parent and then selecting the children from there. Now, in this case, actually the parent of navlink is this nav item. And the only thing that nav item includes is always just one link. So you see that each of the link is actually inside of one nav item like this. And so now we would have to move up manually, not just once, but twice. And so instead of doing that, we will again use the closest method. Okay? So again, instead of moving up manually like 1 or 2 steps, we can simply search for a parent which matches a certain query. And so that's a bit more robust, because even if we would then at some point maybe change the structure of this HTML here, then our JavaScript would keep working. All right, so let's say or link, and then find the closest parent, and let's actually search for nav again. Okay, even though that's not the closest parent, I mean, there is another parent to these links, which is this one here, but it's no problem of also choosing an even higher up parent like we are doing here. So we are now at a parent of all of the links, and so now from there we can search for the nav links again. And so these are then going to be the siblings of our initial links. And so, as we already learned before, we can use query selector on an element to search for a certain query only in that element. Okay, and we are looking for these nav links, of course. And now let's actually also select the logo, and we could select it manually also by its class name, but let's just suppose that there are many navigations on this page. And so again, to make the solution really robust, it's best to simply move up to the closest parent, in this case the navigation, and then from there we simply search for an image. All right, and so this then will work not only on this navigation, but it would work also on others. So this selector here is simply for any image which has the image tag. Okay, all right, so we have all our elements selected. Now we just need to change the opacity basically of the siblings of the selected link. So siblings dot for each, and now we actually need to do that comparison that we did before. So checking if the current element is not the link itself, because of course this sibling here, so these siblings, they will contain our initial link as well. Okay, so it needs to be different from link, and actually here we need a query selector all, right? We want all the links, not just the first occurrence. Okay, but then for all the others that are not the original link, we want to change the opacity to 0.5. And indeed, we want to do the same with the logo. So logo.style. And let's see what we have already. And you see that it works, right? Beautiful. Now, the thing is that, of course, it doesn't go back. So once we have it at 0.5, it will not automatically go back to the opacity of 1, which is the original one. You see? So when I hover this, all the others become 0.5, but as I move out, then everything remains the same. Okay? And so that's why we have this mouse out event to basically undo what we did here. So let's take all of this, paste it here, and change this to 1. All right. And so let's see what happens now. And yeah, everything goes back to 1. And so this actually works. Now, of course, it doesn't work with the logo, because this entire effect only works if the target contains the navlink class, right? But that wasn't the point anyway. We just wanted this to work on any of the links. And notice that this button here is actually also a link element, and so it also works on that one. All right. So our effect here is actually working already, but this is of course very repetitive. So the code here is always the same, and so we need to make our code a little bit more dry here, of course. So let's refactor this code. And usually refactoring works by creating a new function. And so let's do that here. of function. And we will need some arguments here, but more about that later. So what we need to do now is to compare these two pieces of code that we are trying to refactor and then figure out what is the same and what is different. So in this case, that's pretty simple. So all that changes is that here we have the opacity 0.5 and here we have the opacity of 1. And so we can simply take this code and create an argument or a parameter for that opacity. And we can then pass that opacity into the function. All right. So of course we also need the event here. So that's going to be the first one. And then we need the opacity. And so here we simply replace that by opacity. Okay. And so like this, we refactored our code very nicely here. But now, how do we actually use this function here? So usually when we have the event handler as a separate function, all we do here is to pass in that function, and then it's going to work just like this, right? So we have done this many times throughout this course, right? But now the problem is that we actually want to pass in values into this function, right? So we need to tell this function to use the opacity of 0.5 in this case and of 1 in this case. All right. Also, we need a way of passing this event. So right now, none of this would work. So let me show that to you. So not clicking, of course, but you see it would not really work. Okay. So maybe you would think that we could do this. So like maybe passing an event here and then 0.5, which is the opacity that we want. But this, of course, is not going to work. So the first problem is that E is, of course, not defined. But the main problem really here is that addEventListener here expects a function. So we need to pass a function. But if we call the function, then all of this here will become some other value. In this case, that's undefined because we don't return anything from this function. All right. And so this is simply not going to work. So we talked about this many times, but it's always good to remember that JavaScript indeed expects here a function and not just some other regular value, which would be the result of calling the function like this. Now the solution to this problem would be to still have a callback function here, like a regular one, which JavaScript will then call for us whenever the event happens. And then in here, we could then actually call this function with the event, which is this one, and then our opacity, so 0.5. And so this works because here we are basically calling the function manually. So this will only be executed as soon as JavaScript executes this function value. And so here we are back to working because here we are back to passing in a real function. Okay? And then let's right away do the same here. Set it to 1. And now it should be working again. And it does indeed. Okay, so that is the second version of our code working, but we can actually do even better and remove these anonymous callbacks functions here altogether. So this looks a little bit ugly, right? Like having just this one function, which in turn will call another function. And so as I just said, we can do even better, and that is by using the bind method that we already studied before. So remember that the bind method creates a copy of the function that it's called on, and it will set the this keyword in this function call to whatever value that we pass into bind. Okay, so let me just do that here in practice. So handle hover and then dot bind. Okay, and I think we actually already did an example like this. So using bind in an event handler. And so let's set 0.5 here just as before. All right, and now let's do the same here. So handle hover dot bind and then 1. And so this is going to work because this is going to be also a function, because bind, remember, returns a new function. Now in this function, the this variable will now be set to this value, so to 1 here and to 0.5. And so let's check that out. So the this variable, okay. And so now you see indeed that it is either 1 or 0.5. All right. Now remember that usually the this keyword is equal to current target. So let's also check that. Okay, but current target will of course remain unaltered. So you see that it is still of course the navigation element. Okay, so by default the this keyword is the same as the current target, so the element on which the event listener is attached to. But when we then set the this keyword manually, of course it becomes whatever we set it to. And so now, just like before, we can use that this keyword and use that here. All right, because the this keyword is now our opacity. And so essentially we use the bind method here to pass an argument into a handler function. So let me just write that here. Passing an argument into handler. And I'm using quotes here because of course this is not really an argument. So in fact, we don't even need this here. And in fact, it is impossible to pass another argument into an event handler function. So any handler function like this one can only ever have one real argument. And so in this case, can only ever have one real parameter, and that is the event. But if we want to pass additional values into the handler function, then we need to use the this keyword like we just did here. And if we wanted multiple values, then we could, of course, pass in here like an array or an object instead of just one value. So this is kind of a workaround into the fact that the handler function can only take one argument. So it's a really nice effect, and as I said in the beginning, it also taught us how we can pass arguments essentially into handler functions.